Tonight, in a city of smoke and steel, one reckless wager shatters a quiet life. In a glittering parlor of power, a ruthless magnate points across the room and chooses the least likely girl to be his bride. Laughter cuts like glass. Shame burns hotter than any furnace. By morning, a sealed proposal arrives, salvation for her family, at the cost of her heart. What secret drives a man to gamble with a life? What past returns to haunt his silence? And what happens when duty and desire collide beneath the same roof? Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from. And one thing you love most about historical romances, your stories make this world feel beautifully alive. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1884. The city was a restless furnace of progress, a place where smoke rose like unending prayers from the throats of the steel mills, and every window glowed with the promise or the illusion of fortune. Beneath that grey sky of ash and ambition, 18-year-old Abby Keene hurried up the steep cobblestone streets, her breath ghosting before her as she clutched a worn parcel against her chest. Her mother's stitching needles clicked faintly in her memory, as if urging her forward through the cold. Tonight, she was not merely a seamstress's daughter. Tonight, she would serve at the grand supper of Pittsburgh's industrial lords. The mansion at Grant's Hill loomed like an empire in stone, windows tall and glittering, music trembling through their panes, carriages lined in the street below, steaming horses stamping against the frost. Abby stood for a moment at the servants' entrance, her gloved hands trembling, her heart unprepared for the world behind those doors. Her gown was plain navy wool, hem mended twice, apron freshly pressed. Her cheeks were flushed from the climb, her hair pinned low and tightly to keep from misbehaving. She had promised her mother she would keep her head down, take her pay, and return home before midnight. Inside, chandeliers dripped with crystals like frozen rain, and voices swirled in waves of laughter and cigar smoke. The air smelled of roasted pheasant, expensive perfume, and power. Men in tailcoats spoke of mergers and railroads, their every word heavy with money. Women in satin gowns glittered like jewels beside them, their necks wrapped in pearls, and their eyes trained to judge. Abby kept her gaze on the polished floor, careful to move silently among them with a tray of champagne flutes. Yet curiosity tugged at her. These were the titans who built cities, the men her late father had admired and her mother now feared. At the head of the table sat Silas Blackthorne. He was not laughing. He rarely did. His hair, dark with a thread of silver at the temples, was combed back with austere precision. The sharp line of his jaw and the faint scar at his chin lent his face the authority of one who had conquered more than steel. His gaze was the color of tempered metal, cool, deliberate, and unyielding. Rumor said he had begun as a foundry boy and risen to the height of an empire by sheer will. To Abby, seeing him for the first time was like staring into the furnace's heart, terrible, mesmerizing, and bright enough to burn. The evening thickened with liquor and arrogance. Gentlemen's voices grew louder, careless. Someone, a young investor emboldened by champagne, mocked the working class. You could pluck any factory girl from the gutter, he bragged, and she'd still bow to a man with money in his pockets. Laughter followed, cruel and easy. Abby flinched. Her tray quivered in her hands. It was then that Silas Blackthorne's voice cut through the noise, low, measured, and dangerous. "Any girl, you say?" He turned slightly, his chair creaking. "And you believe none of them would have the courage to refuse us?" The young investor shrugged, careless in his victory. "Name one who would dare." Silas's gaze wandered the room with the precision of a blade. His eyes paused when they found Abby, the quiet girl in the corner, standing straight despite her trembling hands, the faint blush of embarrassment coloring her neck. He studied her as one might study a material never tested for strength. Then, with a faint, sardonic smile, he said, "Very well, I shall marry the least likely girl in this room within a fortnight." For a moment, the room froze. Then came the laughter, bright, merciless, like glass breaking. Abby felt the colour drain from her face as every head turned toward her. The investor clapped his hands, the women whispered behind their fans. Silas did not laugh. He merely lifted his glass, his grey eyes unreadable, as if the cruelty of the moment were a form of business. Abby's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to flee, but her feet rooted to the floor. Every sound, the rustle of silk, the snort of amusement, the soft note of a violin, seemed to conspire against her. She lowered her gaze, fighting tears that burned like acid. When she looked up again, Silas was watching her still, not with mockery, but with an expression she could not name. The supper ended in a blur. Dishes clattered, the guests departed, and the grand parlour dimmed into silence. In the servants' hall, Abby's hands shook as she untied her apron. The other maids whispered of what had happened upstairs, of the wager that made her the night's entertainment. "Don't cry, girl," one said softly. "Men like him forget by morning." But Abby knew they wouldn't. Men like Silas Blackthorne didn't forget anything. When she returned home to the narrow brick house she shared with her mother, she found the fire dying low and the old woman asleep in her chair, a half-finished hem pooling in her lap. Abby knelt beside her, brushing a lock of silver hair from her forehead. "It's all right," she whispered. "It's just work. Tomorrow will be better." But in the cold hours that followed, she lay awake, hearing laughter echo in her mind and seeing the glint of that man's eyes across the glittering table. The next morning dawned pale and still. The mills were quiet. Snow had muffled the city's usual roar. Abby was mending a coat sleeve when a knock sounded at the door. On the step stood a man in a black overcoat, his hat rimmed with frost. "Miss Abigail Keene?" he asked, bowing slightly. "I come on behalf of Mr. Silas Blackthorne." He handed her an envelope, heavy paper, wax seal, edges perfectly cut. Her name was written in a precise, commanding hand. She turned it over, heart pounding, as the man waited in silence. Inside was not an apology. It was an offer, a marriage proposal written in legal language and cold ink. The amount of the settlement was enough to pay her mother's debts and buy back the tiny shop they had lost years ago. Abby stared at the words until they blurred. She felt shame rise in her throat like fire. Was this his amusement, his victory, or something darker, more deliberate? The solicitor cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackthorne awaits your answer by evening. He does not repeat offers." When the door closed, Abby sank into her chair, trembling. Her mother stirred, coughing weakly, whispering her name. "What is it, child?" Abby looked down at the letter, the wax seal now broken, the ink glistening faintly in the grey morning light. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's a proposal, Mama." Her mother frowned, half dreaming. "From whom?" Abby's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "From a man who doesn't believe I could say no." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the city's smokestacks pierced the cold sky like monuments to pride and ruin. Somewhere beyond them, Silas Blackthorne was already at his desk, calculating his next move, unaware or perhaps certain that the girl he had humiliated might just accept his wager after all. The wedding took place on a Wednesday morning, under a sky of dull pewter, without bell, choir, or guest. It was held in the study of a magistrate on Penn Avenue, a room that smelled faintly of tobacco and old ink. The fireplace had gone cold. The walls were lined with legal volumes that stared down with the same impassive silence as the men within them. Abby stood between two strangers and a man she barely knew. She wore her best dress, navy wool, carefully pressed, though the hem still showed its age near the shoes. Her gloves were borrowed, a shade too tight, the leather cracked across the palms. Her hair was pinned in a smooth, simple twist at the nape of her neck. She had no bouquet, no veil, no ribbon. Only the iron weight of a decision that could not be unmade. Silas Blackthorne stood beside her in a black coat and dark grey waistcoat, his cravat neat as a blade. His posture was flawless, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He neither looked at Abby nor touched her hand when the magistrate asked if he would take her as his lawfully wedded wife. His reply was quiet. "I will." She, after a long silence, answered the same. "I will." And it was done. No kiss marked the end. Only the scratching of a pen across the registry and the brief clearing of the magistrate's throat before returning to his ledgers. Silas handed Abby into a waiting carriage without a word. The cold morning fog clung to the windows as the city passed in muffled silence. Iron railings, soot-streaked facades, a newsboy shouting the day's headlines. Abby kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered to the thin gold band on her finger. It felt heavier than it looked. Blackthorn House rose at the top of Grant's Hill like a monument to solitude. Built of grey limestone with high chimneys and shuttered windows, it surveyed the smoking city below like a fortress keeping watch. As they approached, the carriage wheels echoed sharply against the gravel drive. The doors opened before Silas could knock. At the threshold stood a tall woman in black, her expression composed but unmistakably cool. "This is Mrs. Thatcher," Silas said, his voice like frost on glass. "She manages the household." Mrs. Thatcher inclined her head. Her cap was starched to perfection. Her keys jingled softly at her waist as she stepped aside. Abby crossed the threshold and felt the air change. Quiet, colder, scented faintly of coal smoke and beeswax. "And this is Mr. Yarrow," Silas added. The butler emerged from a shadowed corridor, thin and sharp-faced, with thinning silver hair and pale eyes that missed nothing. He bowed with mechanical grace, hands folded neatly behind his back. "Mrs. Blackthorn, welcome." The name hit Abby like a gust of wind. "Mrs. Blackthorn." "Mrs. Keene," Silas corrected absently. "Prefers to be addressed by her maiden name for now." He said nothing more. They did not dine together. A meal had been set for Abby in the east drawing-room, a plate of roasted chicken and stewed carrots, a dish of creamed potatoes. The china was delicate, the silver heavy. She sat alone at the grand table, beneath the ticking of an ornate clock, unsure whether to eat or wait. No one came. No voice broke the stillness. Later, Mrs. Thatcher escorted her upstairs through a corridor lined with ancestral portraits. Stern men in dark coats, unsmiling women in pearl earrings. Abby's footsteps echoed over the polished wood. At the end of the hallway, the housekeeper paused before a tall door. "This will be your room," she said. "His lordship's chambers are across the gallery." Abby stepped into a chamber that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The fire had not been lit. The bed was large and covered in a quilt of dark green velvet. The windows looked out over the steel-grey city, now cloaked in dusk. A single oil lamp burned on the writing desk. A dressing gown, her new one, hung on a brass hook. "If you need anything," Mrs. Thatcher said, "ring the bell. Breakfast is served at 8 sharp. Good night." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Abby stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The silence pressed in from all sides, heavy and deliberate. She had been married for less than a day, and already the house felt like a mausoleum. She changed slowly, folding her gloves, her dress, her old petticoat, placing them with care in a drawer too fine for them. She sat at the vanity table and stared at her own reflection. The girl who looked back seemed smaller, older, a bride in name only. She did not cry, but the ache behind her eyes burned deep and constant. That night she did not sleep. She lay beneath the velvet quilt, listening to the wind howl against the shutters and the creak of old wood beneath the house's skin. At some point she heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, precise, passing her door, then fading. She held her breath, but they did not return. By morning, the gossip had already begun. The Blackthorn kitchen bustled with quiet speculation. The laundress had heard from the driver that no guests had attended the wedding. The cook's niece, employed at the dressmaker's, said the bride wore navy wool and walked without a bouquet. Someone at the bakery claimed the marriage had been arranged in a week's time, and someone else, one of the maids perhaps, whispered that it had all started with a wager. The city was a furnace of talk. The Post-Gazette ran a brief notice. Mr. Silas Blackthorne, industrialist and president of Blackthorne Steel, was married yesterday in a private civil ceremony. The bride is said to be a local girl of modest origin. No name was given, but in salons and supper clubs the whispers hissed louder. By the third day, Abby could feel the judgment in the glances of the staff, the ones who said nothing but looked a moment too long. She moved through the house like a ghost, speaking little, observing much. The parlour was never used. The study was locked. The library, though vast, smelled of disuse. It was not a house of family or laughter. It was a house of rules. Silas kept to his schedule. He left early, returned late, always in the same dark coat, always with the faint scent of smoke and metal clinging to him. He did not dine with her. He did not knock on her door. He spoke little, formally, distantly. Are the accommodations acceptable? Yes, thank you. Is there anything you require? No, nothing. Very well. And then silence. It was not hatred. It was something colder, indifference disguised as courtesy. On the seventh day, a bouquet arrived. White lilies, arranged with perfect care, placed on the table in the hallway outside her room. There was no note. Abby stared at them for a long time. They were beautiful, but they held no meaning without the hand that offered them. That evening, she walked alone in the gallery, her fingertips grazing the carved railing as she listened to the storm gathering outside. Thunder rolled in the distance. The house seemed to breathe with the coming rain. She paused before one of the tall windows and watched as lightning split the sky over the river. The glow illuminated the smokestacks below, rising like black spires in a city that thrived on fire and ash. In her heart, Abby felt something shift, not despair, not yet hope, but a kind of quiet resolve. She had entered this house not as a bride, but as a wager. But she would not let herself be diminished into silence. The house had spoken. Now it would listen. She turned from the window, lifted her chin, and walked back down the corridor, her footsteps steady, her eyes unclouded. She would wait. She would learn. And she would remember everything. The first thaw of early spring did not come with sunlight, but with a slow loosening of the earth, as if even the stones of Pittsburgh had grown weary of ice. In the high rooms of Blackthorne House, the windows remained shuttered, and the air, though warmer, still carried the quiet weight of winter. Abby awoke each morning to the same ritual. Breakfast served in silence, a fire already lit by unseen hands, and a hollow stillness that pressed against the walls like another layer of insulation. She had been a wife for over 3 weeks now, and yet no one spoke the word to her. In the market, in the bakery, in the glances of those who whispered behind gloved fingers, she was still the wager bride, the girl whose name had been traded like coin among powerful men. And within the house, she had become a shadow, not mistress, not servant, not anything that could be cleanly defined. But Abby Keene had never belonged to silence, and she would not start now. On a damp morning in mid-March, she found herself wandering the edge of the estate grounds, her boots caked with soft mud, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. The fog clung low to the grass. The hedges, once trimmed with military precision, had begun to rebel in slow-growing tangles. Past a moss-darkened stone wall and a collapsed garden arch, she spotted the old carriage house. The building stood alone, its roof slanted, ivy creeping along the east side. A padlock dangled from the door like a forgotten secret. She could have turned back, but something in her heart, some flicker of purpose long smothered, would not allow it. She returned that afternoon with a rusted key she had discovered in the back of a drawer in the upstairs linen cabinet. The lock resisted, then gave with a loud snap, and the door creaked open on brittle hinges. Inside, the air smelled of old straw and memory. Dust motes danced in the pale light streaming through warped wooden slats. A workbench leaned against one wall, its surface marked by the stains of oil and time. In the corner, beneath a threadbare tarp, sat an abandoned writing desk. 3 wooden chairs lay stacked in a crooked pile, and on the far wall, still nailed in place, hung a cracked chalkboard. Abby took a step forward, then another. She ran her fingers over the surface of the desk and felt something stir in her chest. Not grief, not yet hope, something between the two. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and began to wipe. The next morning, she returned with a bucket, soap, and a rag, then with matches and a lantern. Then, days later, with a basket of books, spellers, arithmetic primers, a battered Bible. The room began to change, subtly, like a face remembered through fog slowly coming into focus. She swept the floor. She repaired the window latch. She wrote on the chalkboard, reading at 7 o'clock. All welcome. No signature, no explanation. Just chalk clean and white against the black. For the first 3 nights, no one came. On the 4th, just as she was about to douse the lantern, a knock sounded at the open door. Abby turned to find a young man in the threshold, tall and lean, with dark skin bronzed by long hours at the furnace, his coat too large for his frame. His boots were worn nearly through at the toes. "You wrote about reading," he said. His voice was low, cautious. "That for real?" "It is," she replied. "Are you here to learn?" He nodded once, tight. "Name's Caleb Doyle." She gestured to the chair nearest the chalkboard. "Come in, Mr. Doyle. You're very welcome." He hesitated before stepping fully into the room, glancing over his shoulder as though unsure whether he'd be followed. Then, quietly, he sat. They began with the alphabet. He knew most of it, but the letters blurred when placed together. Numbers came easier. His hands were calloused with arithmetic, the silent language of the mill floor. He wrote with care, tongue pressed to his lower lip, and looked up now and then with a flicker of pride. Abby did not praise too quickly. She asked questions. She offered gentle corrections. She let the silence between them settle like a bridge rather than a wall. The next night, he returned, this time with another boy, no more than 14, who said little but copied every figure Abby wrote on the board. On the 6th night, there were 5. By the 10th, there were 9. They came in their work clothes, smelling of smoke and sweat, some limping from minor injuries, some too tired to speak. Abby greeted each one by name, offered bread and tea, and handed out slates with the reverence of a priestess preparing a ritual. The schoolroom grew warm with lantern light and purpose. She read to them from the newspaper, explaining the words, letting them ask questions. They read the Bible aloud in turn, stumbling over verses, laughing when a friend made a mistake. She watched them grow bolder, not only with the chalk but with each other. Respect was born in that room, not demanded but earned, hour by quiet hour. She had almost begun to believe the house had forgotten her, but Blackthorn House remembered. It was a Thursday evening, rain soft against the shutters, when he appeared. She was bent over Caleb's slate, guiding his hand through a long division problem, when the door opened behind her. The sound was unhurried, deliberate. Abby turned. Silas stood just within the doorway, his coat still damp from the storm. His eyes moved over the scene, the boys hunched over their work, the warm glow of the lamps, Abby's hand still poised near Caleb's. She stood. "Good evening," she said evenly. He said nothing for a moment. The boys looked between them like deer sensing a hunter in the trees. "Dismiss them," he said softly, but with no doubt he'd be obeyed. Abby turned to her students. "Gentlemen, that's all for tonight. Thank you. We'll continue tomorrow." They filed out quickly, murmuring thanks, some glancing nervously at the man in the doorway. When the last footsteps faded, Silas stepped forward. "You've been holding classes," he said. "I have, without permission." "I did not know I required it." His jaw tightened. "You're the lady of this house, and yet you invite strangers, workers, onto the grounds at night?" "I invite boys who cannot read, men who want a better life than broken bones and soot-filled lungs. Yes, I do." Her voice remained calm but firm. "If this displeases you, I suggest you make yourself clearer." He stared at her for a long moment. She did not look away. "You're not afraid of me," he said at last, his tone unreadable. "I am not afraid of a man who turns his face from suffering." His gaze darkened, not with anger, but something colder, something nearly vulnerable. "You think you know what I turn away from, Abigail?" She took a step forward. "I think you built a house that keeps everyone at arm's length. I think you married a woman you did not want, and I think you came here tonight, not because the school offends you, but because it frightens you." The rain beat steadily against the windows. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The space between them pulsed with something electric, wordless, not desire, not yet tenderness, but recognition. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its sharpness. "Be careful, Abby. This city doesn't love a woman who thinks too loudly." She lifted her chin. "Then I shall not seek its love, only its respect." He turned without another word and left, but Abby remained standing long after the door closed, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling faintly. Something had shifted, not in her favor or his, but in the shape of the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence before a flame catches fire. By the time spring deepened into early summer, the nights no longer smelled of frost and coal smoke, but of river water, lilac and metal. Pittsburgh lived to the rhythm of its furnaces, the hiss of steam, the clang of iron, the dull thunder of the mills that fed the city's pride and its hunger. To the men who worked there, the mills were both a curse and a promise. To Abby Keene Blackthorne, they were a wound she longed to heal, though she scarcely knew how deep it ran. The days passed with strange regularity in Blackthorne House. Silas departed at dawn, returning after dark, his hands smelling faintly of iron filings and tobacco. Meals were served in silence, with Mrs. Thatcher presiding like a sentinel. The house itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of its master, precise, methodical, unbending. Yet below that rhythm, Abby had built another world in secret. Each evening, when the household grew still, she would light her lantern and walk the narrow path to the carriage house. The mill boys awaited her there, weary but eager, their fingers blackened from the day's labor, their eyes bright with determination. Caleb Doyle, steady and soft-spoken, had become her right hand, helping the younger ones sound out words, teaching them to hold their pencils correctly. They read from the newspaper, from worn psalm books, from whatever scraps of print she could gather. Abby had learned the power of words early in life, the way they gave shape to invisible hope. Now she watched that same awakening spread through the men around her, and though she knew Silas disapproved, she could not stop. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, under a sky the color of tarnished brass, that the world she had built in quiet was shaken apart. A mill whistle sounded too soon. Then came another, longer, sharper. A cry of alarm echoed across the valley. Abby was in the drawing room mending a tear in her shawl when Mrs. Thatcher burst through the doorway, pale and breathless. "There's been an explosion at the east boiler," she said. "They're bringing the injured to the yard." Abby's needle fell from her hand. "How many?" "2 dead, perhaps more. The rest hurt badly. Mr. Blackthorne has gone there himself." Without hesitation, Abby gathered blankets, towels, and bottles of carbolic. She ignored Mrs. Thatcher's protests and ran through the corridor, her skirts sweeping the dust as she flew down the steps and out into the daylight. The air outside was thick with the smell of burnt oil and iron. Men moved like shadows through the smoke, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes wild with fear. 2 wagons arrived, carrying bodies laid on planks. Abby rushed forward, kneeling beside the first man. A boy, no older than 16, his face grey, his hair singed. He was not moving. The second man groaned softly, one arm twisted unnaturally, the skin blistered. She tore strips from her own underskirt to make bandages. Someone shouted for water, another for ice. Abby worked without pause, her fingers slick with blood and soot, her voice steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. "Easy now," she whispered to the man whose eyes fluttered open. "You're safe. Help is here." Behind her, a carriage thundered to a stop. Silas leapt down before the horses halted. His face was drawn, his coat streaked with grime. He strode forward, barking orders to the foreman. "Get the men clear of the south gate. No one enters the main floor until I say so." His tone left no room for argument. Then he saw her, Abby, kneeling in the mud, her sleeves rolled, her hair escaping its pins, her hands stained red. For a moment his expression faltered, not in anger, but in something perilously close to astonishment. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, voice low but sharp. "What you would have others do," she said without looking up. "Help. This is no place for you." "Then make it one." Their eyes met, and for an instant the noise around them dimmed, the shouting, the clatter, the chaos. It was as if the two of them existed in the still point between fury and grace. He hesitated, then turned to a foreman. "Get more water," he ordered, "and bring blankets from the storehouse." Hours later, when the last of the injured had been taken to the infirmary, Abby washed her hands in a basin of cold water until her skin stung. Silas stood a few feet away, his coat discarded, his shirt collar open, the faint sheen of sweat across his brow. His hands trembled once before he clasped them behind his back. "2 men are dead," he said quietly. "Another won't walk again." Abby dried her hands slowly. "And yet you still call it an accident." He looked at her, weary and defensive. "You think I wished this? I think you could have prevented it." His jaw tightened. "You know nothing of what it takes to run a mill. And you know nothing of what it means to be one of your workers," she shot back. The words hung between them, heavy and electric. For the first time, Silas looked uncertain, as though the ground beneath his command had shifted. Then, with a bitter exhale, he said, "You should rest. I'll send word when matters are settled." He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. "You did well today," he said softly, almost unwillingly. "Even if you had no right to be there." She said nothing, but long after he left, his voice lingered in the air like the echo of a confession. That evening, the rain returned, soft, steady, cleansing. Abby sat by the fire in her room, the flames reflected in her tired eyes. When she rose to change, she noticed something on her writing desk. A single red rose placed in a narrow glass vase. The petals glowed deep and velvety against the lamplight. There was no card, no note, no explanation, but the gesture itself was enough. It was not apology nor forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. She touched the edge of a petal with her fingertips. Its softness startled her. In a house where everything was sharp and cold, that single bloom felt like a secret left in plain sight. "Downstairs," the servants whispered. Word of the accident spread faster than the smoke had. Some said the men blamed faulty equipment. Others said it was sabotage by workers fed up with impossible hours. Rumours took root in taverns and alleyways. The name Blackthorn carried a weight that could no longer command only fear. It now summoned resentment. Abby heard fragments of these stories carried by the wind through open windows. When she ventured into the kitchen, conversation stopped mid-sentence. She ignored it. Instead, she found solace in the company of those who did not treat her as rumor, the boys of the night school. A week after the accident, the carriage house filled again. Caleb was there, quieter than usual, his sleeves still stained with soot. He had known one of the dead. Abby did not ask which. She simply began to read. Her voice was low, steady, melodic. The men listened in stillness, their faces dimly lit by the lanterns, the sound of rain tapping against the roof. When she paused, one of them, a man with scars across his hands, cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "we heard the boss himself was there that day. Never seen that before." "He was," Abby said. "He helped as best he could." Caleb looked up, eyes shadowed. "Then maybe he's not as heartless as they say." Abby met his gaze. "No man is born heartless," she said quietly, "but some forget they have a heart until something breaks it open." Outside, thunder murmured over the river. At the kitchen window of Blackthorn House, Mrs. Thatcher stood watching. She had come looking for the source of the voices, the faint cadence of reading, the laughter that followed a mispronounced word. Her hands rested on the sill, the lamplight glancing off the ring of keys at her waist. Through the glass, she could see Abby seated at the front of the room, her hair loose at the temples, her face lit from within by the flickering glow of the lantern. Around her the workers leaned forward, listening as though her words were the only thing standing between them and despair. Mrs. Thatcher's expression softened, barely perceptible. She lingered a moment longer, her blue eyes reflective, her lips pressed together not in disapproval but in thought. Then, quietly, she drew the curtain and turned away. In the carriage house, Abby closed the lesson with a prayer, her voice trembling not with fear, but with conviction, and as the men rose and thanked her, she looked toward the door, half expecting a shadow to appear there, a tall figure, silent, watching. But there was only rain. Still, when she returned to her room that night, she found herself glancing at the rose on her desk. It had begun to wilt, its petals folding inward like a secret kept too long. And yet, even as it faded, its fragrance lingered, sweet, defiant, and alive. Somewhere within the vastness of Blackthorn House, another kind of fire had begun to burn. Not of steel or industry, but of something far more dangerous, something neither she nor Silas yet dared to name. The days stretched long and restless as midsummer settled over Pittsburgh like a fever. The heat clung to the city in damp waves, curling the pages of newspapers and warping floorboards in the grandest homes. Even the steel mills seemed to sweat, their chimneys belching smoke into a sky already thick with heat. The air was too heavy to breathe easily, and the tension among the men who toiled inside the forges grew as blistering as the furnaces themselves. Whispers moved through the alleyways and across loading docks, whispers of late wages, of men dismissed for speaking too loudly, of hands crushed and never compensated. The memory of the boiler explosion still hovered like ash in the minds of the workers. No one had forgotten the names of the dead, no one had forgiven the silence that followed, and yet within the walls of the old carriage house a different fire burned, one that did not destroy, but illuminated. Abby continued her nightly lessons, unshaken by the rumors or the weight of her husband's cold glances across the breakfast table. Each evening she lit the lanterns, swept the dust from the floor, and welcomed the boys with bread, fresh water, and open books. The school had become a sanctuary, not just for learning but for quiet resistance, but not everyone welcomed it. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky dim with an oncoming storm, when the first stone broke through the window. The crash shattered the lesson like a gunshot. Glass exploded across the floor, and the boys leapt to their feet, eyes wide. Abby stood frozen for a breathless second, her heart hammering. Then Caleb was at her side, shielding her with his body, scanning the shadows beyond the doorway. "Stay inside!" he ordered the others, his voice low and tight. Abby followed him into the night. The air smelled of rain and smoke. She could see nothing in the darkness beyond the flickering of the lantern hanging from the post. Whoever had thrown the stone was long gone. Only silence remained, and the mocking echo of shattered glass. "It's a warning," Caleb muttered, jaw clenched. "They think we're stirring up trouble, that you're making men think they're worth more than they are." Abby looked at the broken pane and felt no fear, only resolve. "Then we'll put in a new window," she said softly. "And tomorrow we'll read louder." The next morning, Mrs. Thatcher found Abby in the pantry, selecting linens for the night's lesson. Her stern face remained unreadable, but her fingers tapped once firmly on the folded napkins. "You ought to be careful," she said. "Too much light draws shadows." Abby met her gaze. "Would you have me stop?" Mrs. Thatcher's lips pressed together. "No, but I would have you carry a lantern in both hands." That evening, Abby noticed something peculiar. The butler, Mr. Yarrow, passed by the schoolroom twice, once with a decanter and once without. He did not look inside, but she could feel his presence like a draught at her back. Something was shifting in the house. The silence had grown watchful. 3 days later, the fire came. It began with the scent, burnt cotton and scorched air. Abby was in the schoolhouse helping Caleb's cousin Milo with his penmanship when the first bell rang out from the direction of the mill yard. At first, they thought it was another drill. Then came the shouting, then the glow. Caleb was on his feet before she could rise. "The east yard," he said. "That's where the oil barrels are." The boys surged into action, no need for instruction. They had seen fire before. They knew how quickly it devoured. Abby followed them into the night, her skirts gathered in her fists, breath sharp as she raced behind them. The sky was streaked with red and gold, the flames painting the blackened mill walls with a cruel beauty. Smoke coiled upward in great suffocating clouds. Men shouted over each other, their voices frantic. A bucket line had already begun to form. Boys passing pails from hand to hand, water sloshing, feet slipping in the mud. Without a word, Abby took her place. She did not stop to think, only moved, filling, passing, returning. Her arms ached, her lungs burned. Sparks floated through the air like wild stars. The heat pressed against her skin, unrelenting. She did not see Silas arrive, but she felt his presence, sharp as lightning. He appeared like a shadow forged from smoke, his coat thrown off, his sleeves rolled, his jaw set in fierce command. He took charge instantly, directing the lines, barking orders with brutal clarity. The men obeyed, not because they feared him, but because in that moment he moved like one of them. A scream cut through the chaos. "Someone's still inside." The voice came from the far side of the yard. Abby turned, just as Caleb stumbled from the shadows, wild-eyed. "Milo! He went back for a tool chest. He didn't come out." Silas didn't hesitate. He handed his lantern to the nearest man and ran straight into the smoke. "Silas!" Abby cried out, instinct rising above propriety. But he was already gone. The seconds stretched like hours. Abby stood frozen, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening in her ears. Around her the flames crackled, the buckets moved, the shouting continued, but she heard nothing. Then he emerged. Silas stumbled from the smoke, coughing, one arm wrapped around the limp body of a boy no older than 15. His shirt was singed, his hands black with soot, but he was alive. And so was Milo. The crowd roared. A foreman rushed to take the boy from his arms. Silas collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Abby ran to him, her hands trembling as she reached for his face. "You're burned," she whispered. "Your hands. Silas, your hands." He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw no armor, no distance, only pain, and something deeper, something that looked almost like need. "Help me stand," he murmured. She did. They walked together, slowly across the yard. She supported his weight, her arm around his waist, his breath hot against her cheek. The others watched in silence, unsure whether to bow their heads or hold their gaze. Inside the infirmary, Abby worked quickly. She washed his wounds, her fingers gentle as they wiped away soot and blood. He winced, but did not pull away. She bound his palms in clean cloth, smoothing the linen with care. "Why did you go in after him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I couldn't live with leaving him behind," he answered. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. She dipped a cloth into cool water and pressed it gently to his forehead. He closed his eyes beneath her touch. The room was still, the air between them charged with something that could not be spoken. When she finished, she placed a glass of water by his bedside. "You should rest." Silas reached for her wrist, not tightly, but with the weight of unspoken things. His voice was low. "Abby." She paused. "Thank you." She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. That night, the rain returned. A soft, steady rhythm against the windows. Abby stood in the doorway of the infirmary, watching the dark city breathe beneath the storm. Behind her, Silas slept, not as a magnate or a husband of cold calculations, but as a man who had chosen to risk his life for someone who mattered little to the world, but much to a boy who learned to read beneath a broken roof. She turned back once, her hand resting on the frame. And in that moment, without words, she knew that something had changed. Not fully, not forever, but enough to plant a seed in the scorched ground they had both stood upon, not of forgiveness, but of something dangerously close to hope. The infirmary had fallen silent long before midnight. A soft wind carried the scent of charred timber and damp stone through the open windows, and the fire in the grate had burned down to red embers. The only sound left was the occasional creak of old wood and the steady, even breathing of the man in the bed. Abby sat in the high-backed chair beside him, still in the same clothes she had worn during the fire, mud-streaked, soot-kissed, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Her hands, now clean, rested quietly in her lap, but the tension in her shoulders had not eased. There was too much yet unsaid, and silence, once her shield, now pressed against her like a question she could no longer avoid. Silas stirred, shifting against the pillows, his bandaged hands resting limply at his sides. In the flickering glow of the fire, his face seemed older, not in years, but in memory. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking until they found hers. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice rough, as if unused to vulnerability. "I am." He was silent for a long moment, then gave a soft, rueful smile. "That surprises me." "It shouldn't." Silas turned his head slightly on the pillow. "I don't know how to talk to you when you look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you see someone I might have been before all of this." Her eyes did not leave his. "Then tell me who that man was." He inhaled slowly, as though drawing breath from somewhere deep in the past. "I was born in Braddock. You'd hardly recognize it now. My father worked the furnaces until the bottle took him. My mother scrubbed floors, begged when she had to. There were 6 of us. I was the oldest." Abby said nothing, only listened. "I started working at 10, he continued. I learned to carry more than I weighed, learned to keep quiet, learned that hunger can twist a man into something brittle. We slept on straw. We boiled cabbage 3 times. When the mills grew, I grew with them, but I made a vow somewhere along the way that I would never be poor again, that no one would ever look at me and see lack." He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at the burns on his hands. Abby stood and moved to the side of the bed, gently propping a pillow behind his back. He allowed it, watching her the whole time with a gaze too raw to be called guarded. "I met a girl once," he said, his voice softer. "When I was 20. Her name was Clara. She was the daughter of a bookbinder. Not rich, but proud. She had ink on her fingers and laughed at everything I said. I thought I'd marry her." Abby's breath caught in her throat. "She died that winter," Silas said quietly. "Influenza. She was gone in 3 days. And after that, I stopped building anything soft. I built iron, I built walls, I built a life that didn't depend on anyone who could be taken from me." A long silence passed. Abby moved back to her chair and sat slowly, the shadows of the fire flickering across her face. "And the wager?" she asked at last. He flinched, not visibly, but she saw it in the way his eyes dropped to the fire. "It was foolish," he said. "Vindictive. I had come from a meeting where everything I proposed was met with derision. They called me a brute, a relic. One of them, Elias Godfrey, made a comment about my origins, said no woman of standing would ever marry me willingly." Abby's hands curled slightly around the arms of the chair. "I wanted to prove him wrong," Silas said, "so when the moment came, when I saw you there, standing calm and proud with a tray in your hands, I pointed, and I won the bet." Abby said nothing. Her heart beat slower now, but deeper. "I didn't know your name then," he added, "but I should have waited to learn it. That was my greatest mistake." She stood again, quietly this time, and walked to the mantel. The fire cast warm light across her face, but her eyes were distant. "I wasn't a woman of standing," she said. "Not by their measure, but I had dignity. I still do." Silas nodded slowly. "I know. And you used me to humiliate a man who mocked your worth. But in doing so you questioned mine." Her voice did not tremble. It did not rise. But it carried the weight of everything she had endured. The broken stares, the whispered mockery, the ache of a marriage born without kindness. He looked at her then, with something unspoken. Regret, yes, but also recognition. "I can't undo what I did," he said, "but I can live differently because of it, if you'll let me." Their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The wind shifted, and the shutters trembled gently. Abby walked to the window and closed it, her fingers brushing the edge of the curtain as she turned back toward him. "You are not the man I feared when I married you," she said. "And you are not the girl I thought I chose," he replied. "You are far more than that. You became necessary." The firelight flickered between them like a secret. He reached toward her, not with command, but invitation. She hesitated, then crossed the room and took his hand gently in hers. He did not flinch from the pressure. Her fingers closed softly over his palm. In that charged, delicate stillness, their closeness held a gravity that needed no explanation. Abby felt her breath catch, not because of fear, because of understanding. Silas leaned slightly toward her. She did not pull away. Their faces hovered near, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, the trembling possibility of a kiss that had not yet been claimed. Her heart beat against her ribs, fierce and unyielding. But then, a knock at the door, firm, insistent. They parted instantly. Abby stepped back, her cheeks flushed. Silas blinked, collecting himself. Mrs. Thatcher entered, her face tight. "There's a message," she said, her voice brisk. "From New York, marked urgent." She handed it to Silas and paused only long enough to glance between them before turning away. He unfolded the telegram slowly, his brow furrowing as he read. Then he cursed under his breath. "What is it?" Abby asked. He handed her the slip of paper. "Godfrey went to press. Tomorrow's Herald will print. Lead headline: She was bought, the truth behind the Iron Bride." Abby read it twice before lifting her gaze. The flush on her cheeks had vanished. In its place was something colder, steelier. "They mean to shame me." "No," Silas said grimly. "They mean to shame me. You're just the weapon." Abby folded the paper slowly, placed it on the nightstand and lifted her chin. "Then we'll give them a reason to regret it." He stared at her, at the fire in her eyes, the unwavering steadiness of her spine. The girl he had wagered on was long gone. In her place stood a woman forged from every humiliation, every silence, every spark of her own defiance. And in that moment, for the first time, Silas Blackthorne understood the full weight of what he had done. He had not ruined her. He had awakened her. And now she would not be silenced, not by him, not by Elias Godfrey, not by any man in Pittsburgh. Outside, lightning cracked the sky wide open, and inside, the storm had already begun. The morning the paper hit the stands, Pittsburgh exhaled smoke and scandal in equal measure. Carriages rattled over cobbled streets, with headlines snapping in the hands of newsboys. Inside cafes and behind marble counters, voices dropped to murmurs and eyebrows rose behind teacups. In boarding houses and mill kitchens alike, women pressed their aprons to their mouths as they read aloud the words, inked in bold, across the top of the New York Herald, and reprinted, unrelenting, by the Pittsburgh Gazette. She was bought, the truth behind the Iron Bride. Abby read the headline once, then again, sitting at the breakfast table of Blackthorne House beneath a chandelier that had once belonged to a Philadelphia duchess. Her tea had gone cold. The silver spoon rested untouched beside her plate. The article sprawled across 2 columns, riddled with half-truths and theatrical language. References to a girl of humble origins plucked from obscurity, a businessman's private wager, and a union that raises more questions than it answers. Her name appeared only once, but it was enough. Abby Keene Blackthorne had become a symbol, and not one she had chosen. Across the table, Silas stood, silent and still, the paper crumpled slightly at the edge where his fingers gripped it. He had not spoken since reading it. He had not even cursed. Abby, however, had already made up her mind. "I want to hold a public meeting," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "At the mill." He looked at her finally. "A meeting?" "Yes, for the workers, their families, the city press, anyone who wants to know the truth." He exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw tightening. "And what exactly will you say?" "That I was not bought," she answered. "That I was underestimated. That I now intend to be heard." He said nothing. Abby rose, crossed to the sideboard, and withdrew a folded document from beneath a linen napkin. She placed it in front of him with deliberate care. "This," she said, "is a proposal, a real one. Not made in a parlour on a whim, not bartered over brandy, and not meant to humiliate anyone." Silas unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the page slowly. A proposal for partnership between Blackthorn Steel and its workers. Formation of shared safety oversight committees. Creation of an education grant fund for workers and their families. Establishment of a mill injury support fund, partially subsidized by executive profits. Evening literacy programs for adult laborers, overseen by certified educators. Abby stood before him, not trembling, not pleading. "This is the future, Silas," she said. "Not scandal, not silence, not power behind curtains. This is how we become more than the names they print on broadsheets." His hands rested on the edges of the document. He did not look at her. Not yet. "You believe the workers will trust this?" he asked. "They won't," she answered honestly. "Not yet, but they will trust the person who says it to them. If that person looks them in the eye and speaks plainly. If that person has stood beside them when it burned." Still, he did not reply, but he did fold the proposal again with careful precision, tucking it into the inner pocket of his waistcoat. Then, without a word, he left the room. Abby remained standing, alone. Moments later, Mrs. Thatcher entered quietly. In her hand was a tray, breakfast, untouched. On it sat the folded newspaper, turned so the headline faced downward. Abby watched as the housekeeper paused, eyes resting on the folded linen beside the plate, the same napkin that had covered her proposal. Mrs. Thatcher hesitated. Then, without looking directly at Abby, she removed the paper from the tray and, in its place, carefully laid the cloth napkin over the dishes. Her fingers smoothed it once, as if the gesture required reverence. She said nothing, but Abby caught the faintest shift in her expression. No longer cold, not yet warm, but human. It was the first act of silent loyalty Abby had received in that house, and it meant everything. The city's reaction came in waves. At the corner market, two shopgirls whispered behind a display of potatoes. "Can you imagine? Marrying him for a bet. I heard she runs a school at night. Still doesn't make her a lady." But in the alley behind the bakery, a mother of 4 turned to the butcher's wife and said, "She gave my boys books last winter, taught them their letters." And at the dressmaker's, a customer snorted as she tossed the paper aside. A social climber, nothing more. Yet across town, in a laundry with cracked windows, a young woman read the article aloud and muttered, "Bought or not, she stood with us when no one else did. Letters arrived at Blackthorn House by the dozen, some cruel, others curious. But a few, tucked between the insults and the questions, were signed in trembling script. Thank you, keep going. You gave us courage." Abby kept them all. That evening, she returned to the schoolhouse. The glass had been replaced, the lamps burned low. Caleb stood near the blackboard, his brow furrowed as he traced a passage from the Gazette aloud for the others. When he saw her, he paused. "They say you married him for money, that you were part of a joke." Abby met his eyes. "That's what they say." Caleb stepped closer. "But I remember you with your hands in the blood of that boy's arm. I remember you staying long after we all went home. I remember you standing when everyone else ducked. Then remember that louder than anything else," she said. He nodded once, then turned back to the board. The night wore on. Lessons continued. The air outside grew heavy with impending rain. Back in her room, Abby lit a single candle and sat by the window watching the storm clouds gather. The flame flickered in the glass. She had not seen Silas since morning. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mr. Yarrow, his expression unreadable as always. He held out a sealed envelope. "For you, madam, delivered by hand." She took it with care, nodding. "Thank you." Inside, the note was written in Silas's hand. The ink was sharp, the script rigid, but beneath it, she could almost feel the pressure of hesitation. "Come to the yard at first light. Bring your voice. You will not stand alone." She held the note to her chest and closed her eyes. The man she had married behind a veil of power had begun to open the curtain, and what she found there was no longer shadow, but something dangerously close to light. The sky had not yet broken into light when the workers began to gather in the yard. They came in silence at first, hands shoved deep into coat pockets, boots scraping over cinder-covered stone. Some wore their caps low, eyes watchful. Others stood with arms crossed, bodies marked by years of heat and labor. The chimneys loomed above them like the towers of a sleeping beast, still cold for now, but waiting to stir. Overhead, the last stars faded into a pale bruise of dawn, and at the center of it all, a wooden platform had been hastily assembled the night before, the planks nailed down by a man who had never spoken from such a place before. Blackthorne himself had ordered it. Abby stood near the base of the platform, wrapped in her blue wool coat, a leather-bound copy of the proposal held firmly in her gloved hands. Her heart beat slow and steady, but her breath caught every few seconds in her throat. The cold wind stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the burn. She wanted to feel everything this morning. She wanted the city to remember. More than 200 men now stood in the open yard, their faces etched by soot and memory. Some she knew by name. Others she knew only by the curve of their shoulders, the way they bent over their slates in the night school, the way they nodded when she passed with books or bread. Wives clustered at the edges. A few children, still half asleep, were lifted onto shoulders to see. Somewhere in the back, Abby spotted Caleb standing tall, his coat patched but clean, his jaw firm. He met her eyes briefly, then nodded once. She nodded back. And then Silas appeared. He walked without escort. No Keene, no guards, no foreman flanking him, just a man in a dark coat with a healed burn on one hand and an envelope tucked beneath his arm. The workers watched him ascend the platform with cautious eyes. Some muttered, a few spat into the dirt, but none turned away. Abby looked up at him as he reached the top. He met her gaze, not with command, but with something softer, something earned. Then he turned to face the crowd. "I won't pretend to deserve your silence," Silas began. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the weight of steel and sorrow. "I have earned your anger, I have earned your doubt, but I ask, just for this morning, that you let me speak plainly." A murmur rose among the men, but no one shouted him down. He continued, eyes sweeping across the yard. "Years ago, I came from nothing. I worked the same lines you do now. I know the ache of standing 12 hours on broken stone. I know what it is to eat once a day. I know what it is to be invisible. And when I rose from that life, I swore I would never go back. But in doing so, I turned my back on too much. I forgot the hands that lifted me. I forgot the faces behind the flames." He paused. One man in the front crossed his arms, unimpressed. Another watched with narrowed eyes. "But the worst of it, the deepest mistake I made, was not in profit or policy," Silas said, his voice tightening. "It was in shame. Shame I buried beneath contracts and silence. Shame I let rot into pride." A stillness fell over the yard. "I married a woman," he said, and here for the first time his voice faltered. "Not out of love, not out of kindness, but out of vanity, a wager, nothing more. I wanted to prove a point, and I chose her, as if she were a commodity." A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Silas raised his hand. "She did not deserve it." and neither did any of you. Because that woman, Abby Keene Blackthorne, is the only person in this city who dared to show me who I had become." He turned toward her now, and the crowd followed his gaze. Abby stood straight, unflinching, the reform plan clutched to her chest like a shield made of truth. "She taught your children to read. She stood at your side in the fire, and she stood at mine in my shame." Silas unfolded the envelope and held the document up. "This is a proposal, her proposal, for you, for your wives, for the boys too young to stand in this yard today. And I am not just presenting it, I am endorsing it, fully." He handed the paper to a foreman in the front row. "Shared safety committees, education stipends, a proper fund for the injured, night schools. It begins now, with your help." A long silence followed. The wind blew through the yard, ruffling hair, flapping coattails. Somewhere, a bird called into the grey light of morning. Then a voice rang out, sharp, mocking, from the rear. "And what's the cost, Blackthorne?" The voice belonged to Elias Godfrey, now stepping forward with polished boots and a coat too clean for this hour. "What deal hides behind this generous proposal? A seat in politics? A new press release? A chance to cleanse your little scandal?" A few workers laughed under their breath. Others turned to look at Abby, suspicion returning to their eyes. Silas didn't flinch, but Abby stepped forward. "There's no cost," she said, her voice clear and bright. "Only the price of honesty, and for some men that cost is too high." The crowd murmured again, but Caleb stepped forward, cutting through the doubt. "I saw them in the fire," he said. "I saw her take my cousin's hand when no one else dared, and I saw him carry the boy out on his own back." He turned slowly to the crowd. "Say what you will, but today I heard a man admit his wrongs in front of all of us. And I saw a woman do more for our sons than any of us dared to ask." He walked up to the foreman holding the proposal and signed his name at the bottom. "I accept it." One by one, others stepped forward. A few reluctant, a few bold, a handful with tears in their eyes. Elias Godfrey stood unmoved, his jaw tight, his eyes livid. But he did not speak again. Silas stepped down from the platform. His boots touched the ground without ceremony. No applause followed him, no victory cry, only a heavy silence that somehow felt like the beginning of something new. Abby joined him as he walked away. They did not touch, but when their hands brushed for a moment, barely softly, he did not pull away. Behind them the yard came alive. Voices rose in low, astonished murmurs. A few men shook hands, others argued, but no one turned back. The proposal moved from hand to hand, and in the air hung the scent of smoke, but not the kind that destroyed. It was the kind that lingered after something had been reforged. And as Abby looked up at the sky breaking open above them, she realized that for the first time since she crossed the threshold of Blackthorne House, she was no longer walking in someone else's shadow. She was walking beside him, and the city would never see her the same way again. The cold returned to Pittsburgh like an accusation. Steel-grey skies hung low over the mills, and the wind carried the bitter sting of ash and smoke. It was the kind of morning that bit into the lungs, that reminded every soul in the yard what the city had been built upon: fire, bone, and the silence of men too proud to speak of pain. The scaffold gave way just before the noon bell. There was a sound like thunder cracking over stone, then screams, sharp, panicked, cut off too soon. A rain of splintered wood and metal crashed into the east yard as workers scattered, some falling, some running, others frozen in place. Silas Blackthorne had been standing beneath it. Abby saw none of it at first. She had been across the grounds, meeting with the wives of 2 injured men, arranging for winter coats and baskets of preserved fruit. But the cry, "It's Mr. Blackthorne," ripped through the wind and reached her like a blade. She ran, boots sliding on gravel, skirts gathered in shaking hands. She ran past stunned workers and smoke-grey walls until she reached the wreckage. The collapsed scaffold was twisted in on itself, beams jutting like broken limbs. Dust hung in the air, thick and choking. And there, half buried under a crossbeam, coat bloodied, head limp, lay Silas. "Help me!" she shouted, dropping to her knees. Her voice cracked with something primal, something raw. Lift it now!" A handful of men obeyed. Not all of them worked for him. One was a boy who had learned his letters in her schoolroom. Another was a foreman whose daughter Abby had sat with during a long night of fever. Together they lifted. Together they heaved. And when the beam gave way, Abby slid her arms beneath Silas's shoulders and held his head to her chest. His breath was shallow. A slow trickle of blood marked his temple. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's still here." They carried him to the infirmary. Abby did not leave his side. She sat at the edge of the cot, dabbing his brow with cool cloths, her fingers trembling as she worked. Outside, the mill roared back to life with a kind of defiant momentum, but the household paused, arrested by fear. News traveled fast. By mid-afternoon, whispers of sabotage churned through the alleys and stairwells. In the schoolhouse, Caleb Doyle closed the shutters and gathered the boys around the fire. "We stay in groups," he said firmly. "No one walks home alone. And if anyone sees anything strange, anyone unfamiliar, we tell Miss Abby, immediately." "But what happened?" one boy asked, eyes wide. Caleb didn't answer. He just stared out the window. Back at Blackthorn House, Mr. Yarrow moved like a shadow, silent, watchful, too calm. Abby noticed it when she returned to the kitchen to fetch hot water. His gloves were already on, though no carriage had been summoned. He watched her with eyes that said nothing, but followed too much. That night she found the ledger. It had been left open, carelessly or perhaps deliberately, on the desk in Silas's study. Pages of figures, margins of contracts, employee names in neat columns. The last page bore a curious notation. Her own name, written in pencil, not ink. Next to it, Social Works under advisement. She felt her throat tighten. She had never asked for the title, never imagined one. But there it was, halfway born, a beginning. When she turned to leave, Mr. Yarrow stood in the doorway. "Curious, isn't it," he said softly, "how one's name can shift so easily from margin to headline?" Abby did not flinch. "You've been watching me." "I watch everything," he replied. "But not for us," she said. "Not for this house." Silence. "I know about the payments," she said. "From Elias Godfrey. Weekly envelopes, delivered through the Greenbrier Club." Yarrow's eyes narrowed. "You have no proof." "I have Caleb. I have the gate boy who saw you take the parcel. And I have a man in the telegraph office who finally looked twice." He stepped into the room then, slowly, almost sadly. "Order must be preserved, Mrs. Blackthorn, even if the old ways are inelegant. Godfrey understands structure. He restores what ambition dismantles." "You mean what decency rebuilds," she said, voice trembling. "You were a wager, Miss Abby," he said coldly. "You forget that. And now, I'm something else." Behind her, a voice rasped from the doorway. "She's my partner." Silas stood there, pale, leaning heavily on his cane, a thin bandage circling his head, but his eyes were alert, furious and sharp. "Pack your things, Yarrow," he said. "You have 20 minutes. You'll regret this." "I already do." Yarrow left in silence. Later that night, when the house had quieted and the lamplight burned low, Silas summoned Abby to the study. He sat behind the desk, but didn't touch the ledger. His hands were folded in his lap. "I meant to show it to you next week," he said quietly. "After the holidays, after the workers had time to adjust." Abby sat across from him, heart still racing. "I'm not interested in a gesture." "It's not a gesture," he replied. "It's an acknowledgement." He opened the book, dipped the pen in ink, and carefully, without trembling, wrote her name again. This time in ink. This time on the official page. Mrs. Abigail Keene Blackthorn, co-director of social works. He signed his name beneath it. "It's yours now," he said. "The title, the authority, the risk." Abby stared at the ink as it dried. "I never wanted the risk." "No," he said, "but you took it anyway. Every time you opened that school, every time you spoke when I was silent, every time you stayed when you could have walked." The clock chimed. Outside, snow began to fall. Silas closed the book gently. "I can't erase how we began, but I can change how we move forward." Abby looked at him then. Truly looked. He was no longer the cruel figure from a smoke-lit parlour who had once wagered her name. He was something broken, something rebuilt. So was she. "I'm not a wager," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're a force." That night, she did not sleep. She walked through the halls of Blackthorn House, past the windows where frost bloomed in delicate spirals, past the schoolhouse where fire still glowed low in the hearth, and past the empty ledgers of her own girlhood, pages once filled with seamstresses' lists and grocery debts. Now her name was written beside steel. Now she would shape more than her own fate. She would shape the city. The snow began to fall before dusk, light as powdered sugar, dusting the eaves of Blackthorn House and settling over the iron gates like a quiet blessing. The chimneys smoked gently. Church bells in the city rang early, their notes soft and distant over the hills. Pittsburgh, ever black with labour, seemed for one night pale with peace. Abby stood in the mirror, fastening a silver clasp at her throat. The dress was deep pine green, modest in cut, with velvet trim at the cuffs and collar. It had once belonged to her mother, a gift from a generous client during a better season. Mrs. Thatcher had quietly altered it days ago, letting out the seams without being asked, then setting it out that afternoon as if it had always been meant for her. In the mirror, Abby did not see a wager. She did not see a girl who had flinched at whispers or trembled in front of ledgers. She saw a woman forged by fire and silence, a woman who had lost the right to choose, then fought to claim it back. The warehouse stood 3 blocks east of the mills, once dark, now gleaming. Lanterns had been hung from every beam and rafter, their glow golden and warm. The old crates had been repurposed into benches, the loading docks swept clean. Garland wound around banisters fashioned from salvaged pipe. Children stood at the front, clutching worn books in gloved hands, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. It was a schoolhouse no longer in hiding. When Abby stepped through the door, a hush rippled through the space, not from fear but from awe. She was no longer the girl from the supper. She was the woman who had fed their children, bound their wounds, and made the steel magnate listen. Caleb met her at the front with a crooked grin. His coat was patched and frayed, his fingers ink-stained, but his posture was proud. "I put it to paper," he said. "The offer. I want the position full-time." Abby's smile trembled, full of pride. "The school will be lucky to have you." He blushed, then stepped aside. The children began to read. One by one, their voices rose, halting but hopeful, reciting stanzas from a Christmas poem Abby had chosen herself. A girl of 8 read the final verse. Her coat was too thin and her boots too large, but she held her chin high. "And in the hush of falling snow, we found a home where fires glow, not stone, nor steel, nor coin, nor land, but kindness offered, hand to hand." Applause thundered, not raucous but reverent. Mrs. Thatcher appeared at Abby's side then, her own dress simpler than usual, her hair tucked neatly under a soft grey cap. She held something in her hands, a woolen shawl, soft and richly woven, lined with fleece and embroidered at the corners. Wordlessly, she placed it over Abby's shoulders and smoothed it down. "You'll need it," she said simply. "It's cold out there." Abby turned to thank her, but the older woman was already stepping back into the shadows. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were no longer guarded. Then came the hush again. This time, not for her, but for him. Silas Blackthorn walked forward, every step measured, his cane tapping against the worn wooden floor. He wore no overcoat, only a black suit, crisp and solemn, and a red wool scarf wrapped at his throat. There were still signs of the scaffold's collapse in the slight stiffness of his posture, the bruise near his temple. But he stood without trembling. He turned to face the crowd. "I won't take long," he began. His voice, rough as always, carried to every corner. "I've spoken in front of men with ledgers and titles. This time I speak in front of those who built the ledgers, who earned the titles for others." A murmur rose, then stilled. "I've been a man who measured worth by production, by silence, by control." He paused. "And one night I made a wager, a cruel one. I pointed to a girl and said I'd make her my wife, to win a room's laughter. And then I did." Gasps, sharp intakes of breath. "She should have left me," he said. "But she didn't. She stayed. She questioned, she taught, she made me face what I'd become. And slowly, she built something better. Not in my house, but in my city." He turned then, and found her in the crowd. "I chose her once on a dare," he said. His voice broke, barely. "I choose her again, freely, and forever." Silence. Then, applause. Not all at once, not a roar, but slow, steady clapping. First from the children, then from the women who had received blankets from her hand, then from men who had cursed her name and now nodded with grudging respect, and then from Caleb, who stepped forward and placed a hand over his heart. Elias Godfrey, watching from the rear, did not clap, but even he did not stop what came next. Abby did not speak. She didn't need to. She stepped forward, took Silas's arm and stood beside him. They left together into the snow. The walk was silent at first. The city held its breath around them. Lanterns glowed in windows, carolers sang in distant streets. The alleys, once dangerous, felt watchful now, no longer haunted but waiting. When they reached the gates of Blackthorn House, Silas turned to her. "You don't have to," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever." Abby looked at him, truly looked. At the man who had once offered her nothing, and now offered choice. "I know," she said. Then she opened the door. Inside, the fire burned low. The house was warm, familiar, changed. She took his hand. She climbed the stairs. And when she stepped through the threshold of his room, it was not as a servant, not as a symbol, but as the woman he had chosen, and the one who had chosen herself. The snow had returned, as it always did in December, brushing the rooftops of Pittsburgh in soft, white hush. But the city was no longer the same. Smoke still coiled from the chimneys, but not as fiercely. The milliards, once darkened by soot and sorrow, now echoed with new voices, louder, brighter, and no longer afraid. Safety rails lined scaffolds. A school bell rang each morning. And just beyond the iron gates of what was once a cold, closed estate, laughter spilled from a house that had learned how to love. Abby stood at the upstairs window, a child at each side. Catherine, just turned 7, was tall for her age, and serious as a scholar. She held a book in one hand and a fir branch in the other, determined to decorate every corner of the schoolhouse herself. Beside her, Thomas, 5 and all dimples, pressed his face to the glass, watching the snow as if he expected it to speak. "Will the other children come soon?" he asked. "Yes," Abby said softly, tucking a curl behind his ear. "And they'll need help with the lanterns. You remember where we keep the matches?" Thomas nodded solemnly and ran off, boots thudding down the polished hall. Alone with the silence, Abby looked out over the city. Blackthorn Steel still stood, but its shadow no longer suffocated the tenement blocks. The company's profits had dipped in the early years, true, but then something strange had happened. Other mills followed the reforms. Worker retention grew, accidents dropped. So did lawsuits. The press shifted from scandal to curiosity, then to praise. The nickname Iron Bride had stuck, but it meant something different now. The woman once mocked in whispers had become a name mothers taught their daughters with pride. Mrs. Thatcher had passed quietly the previous spring. A single folded napkin had been placed on her grave. No words, just that. Caleb Doyle now ran 3 schools across Allegheny County. He had married a girl from the library, They had 4 children, and very little quiet. As for Mr. Yarrow, he had vanished the same night he was dismissed. Some said he had gone east. Others said he had returned to his native England in shame. No one truly knew, and no one, Abby realized, had asked after him in years. The front door creaked open below. She heard the familiar stride before she saw him. Silas still wore black, always would. But time had softened him around the edges. A silver streak ran through his dark hair now. His cane was more necessity than formality. And his eyes, those steel-grey eyes, still sought hers across every room before they landed anywhere else. He stepped into the parlor, shaking the snow from his coat. The first carts have arrived. Lanterns, blankets, and a new printing press from Philadelphia. For the school? Abby asked. For the girls' newspaper, he replied. They're calling it The Ledger's Daughter. Abby laughed, a sound that still surprised him after all these years. She's going to write everything down, you know, she warned. Let her, he said. Let her tell them how her mother burned brighter than any furnace I ever owned. Abby turned, startled by the warmth in his tone. She walked to him, took his hand, and for a moment they simply stood there. 2 people aged by grief, stitched together by defiance and healed by a love neither had expected. Outside, the schoolyard glowed again. Children ran beneath the lanterns. Women arrived with pies. Men brought firewood. Old mill hands raised a toast with cider, not gin. The warehouse, once a place of shadows, now rang with carols and memory. Silas looked down at her hand in his, the same hand he had once tried to own, the same hand that had one day refused to tremble, the hand that now, after everything, held his with quiet strength. You know, he said, voice rough with feeling, I never told you the real reason I left that rose. Abby looked up, a half-smile curling on her lips. No, it was never about apology or guilt. I left it because I knew even then I was already losing. To what? To you, he said simply. To the truth of you. Outside, Catherine's voice rang clear and strong, leading the younger children in a song Abby had once taught from memory. Silas closed his eyes, letting it wash over them like snow. 8 winters had passed, and still she stood by him, not as a prize, not as a savior, but as the woman who had once walked into his house in silence and filled it with music and change and life. Forever chosen, forever choosing. Sometimes the strongest hearts come from the most overlooked souls. Abby's journey reminds us that dignity isn't handed down by fortune, beauty, or power. It is built moment by moment by those who dare to speak, to dream, and to love in a world that told them not to. She was never supposed to matter. She was never meant to be remembered. And yet she changed everything, not by shouting, but by staying, not by demanding love, but by teaching it. Her story is not just about romance. It's about the quiet power of choosing yourself again and again, even when others wouldn't. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you in any small way, we invite you to leave a comment with the word Ironheart, so we know you made it all the way to the end. Your words keep this flame alive and help this little corner of the internet grow with kindred hearts. If you'd like to support the team behind these stories, consider sending a super thanks here on YouTube with any amount that feels right to you. Every gesture of support helps us continue crafting these emotional, historical tales with the care and detail they deserve. But if now isn't the moment to give, that's okay. Sharing this story with someone who might love it too is another beautiful way to help. And if you're not quite ready to leave this world behind, don't worry. I've linked other love stories you might adore in the cards above. Because in every era, love has always found a way. And here, it always will. Thank you for being part of this journey.